The opinions expressed in the following programs are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Rogers Cable or Rogers TV.
Hello everybody, welcome to Voice of Saskatoon and Civically Speaking. My name is Lenora Swiston and I'm here with my co-host
Anika. We're back with another show. Today we'll talk about politics. I'm not very familiar, but I'm here to learn. We have two great speakers and we have some great questions, so you're in for a great show.
Awesome. And you know what? And we do have two great guests. And two, in full disclosure, one I know pretty well now. So I do know Keenan Ashton, a student and somebody who I work with during the day, on and off as a student that works with me in the field of community planning and development and related. And then we have Dr. Westlake here from the Faculty of Political Studies here at the University of Saskatchewan. So welcome to you both to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, yeah.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it was really fun. I'm researching different people about who to bring on the show. I never asked Keenan because I thought I knew he was a student. He's going to have his biases. Then when I told him it was Dr. Westlake, he was like, that's a perfect person to have on the show. Because I was scrolling through going, okay, who can we get on here to kind of set a little bit of context? Mm-hmm. And then Keenan, to yourself, it's just like, I know this is right in your wheelhouse. We talk about this stuff, and Anika, just bringing in the voice of Saskatoon. Yeah. It's about what are things that are important to our community, right? Yeah. And we've got two big events coming up, okay, and possibly others, who knows? I mean, the way political seasons go, that's how it works. Is we've got a provincial election coming up at the end of October, and then we go right into a municipal election, and in between there's this little tiny thing called the American election that's going to take place. So we thought, Dr. Westlake, we'll start with you by just tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit of context. You're somebody that kind of studies politics for a living. So give us a rundown about where you're from and a bit of context about what got you interested in politics and then some of the things that you're studying these days.
Yeah, so I've kind of bounced around academia a bit. I grew up in Edmonton, but was out in Ottawa for an undergrad, over in Vancouver for graduate school, and I've worked at Victoria and Kingston as well as here. So kind of had a chance to see a number of different kind of political environments. I've had the pleasure of teaching a range of students from a range of places, including Keenan here. And then I study kind of Canadian parties and elections and a little bit of multicultural immigration as well.
Okay.
And I mean, I've been interested in this stuff since way back when I was in grade school. I'm a little bit weird that way, and I'm kind of a politics nerd, and will talk about back when the Reform Party was running and stuff like that, which I think has, I think I forget how young my students are. And I think sometimes I've referenced things that kind of look at me as like, I wasn't born when that happened.
Yeah, for sure. So Keenan, student to professor here, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so originally I'm from Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, but I'm a student at the University of Saskatchewan in political studies. I've been around for a long time. I actually started in 2018, but I'm still here. Next year will be my last. I think the big thing that interests me generally is political theory, but I am also interested in Canadian politics generally and Canadian political institutions and things of that nature. And I think similarly to Dr. Westlake, I mean, I've been interested in this stuff since I was really little. Yeah. When I was very small, I used to start sentences with, when I'm prime minister, not if, but when. And I must say that's no longer my main aspiration. I much prefer the study of politics compared to the practice of politics. Yeah. But it has been sort of a lifelong interest.
Oh, that's great.
I ran into a high school teacher of mine I haven't seen since I graduated on the weekend, and she asked me what I was studying, and I said political science, and she said, that sounds about right.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. I know, Anika, you've got a question you want to dig into here.
Perfect. So what is your sense of the political context in our city right now? So I'll start with you.
So it's actually interesting coming from Edmonton to here, because growing up at Edmonton felt a lot like what Saskatoon looks like. in that, like, I grew up in a very left-leaning part of Edmonton, a core, at a time when, I mean, more so than today, Alberta really voted Conservative. And in a lot of ways, Saskatoon feels the same way. You get into places like Nutana, the kind of just the west side across the river. These are fairly left-leaning parts of the city, surrounded by a much, much more conservative province. So that seems to be, that gives me a sense of the kind of the dynamic of the city. There's a progressive course, there is in every city, to the or every province, to the urban areas of the city, but as soon as you start to get out, it gets quite conservative quite quickly, which creates kind of an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, yeah. And what is your thought, Keenan, on it?
I mean, I tend to agree that it creates an interesting juxtaposition between, you know, the city and the countryside. The countryside, I guess. I mean, that's always sort of the main thing when there's a provincial election. Within the city itself, in terms of the political context, it's interesting because you're right, Dr. West. Like, you know, it tends to vote NDP provincially, and but when you get into civic, you know, municipal politics, there's no political parties, and things, you end up with a much more complex, maybe not much more complex, but maybe more sometimes idiosyncratic ideological things happening, where you'll have people who are maybe more left-leaning provincially, can support a councillor who has more right-wing views and on specific, like, civic issues. I think the big issues in our city right now, based on what I'm seeing, people are really focused on safety and related things. So I mean, talk about homelessness and safety. Safety is often sort of just another way of saying homelessness and people, but it's more complex than that, obviously. I mean, a lot of people feel you know, that they're unsafe because of homelessness, but of course homeless people themselves are far more unsafe than anyone who has a permanent place to stay. So homelessness is the big thing, and then like this sort of nebulous concept people talk about of safety, and then as always, people are talking a lot about taxes, property taxes. There have been some increases lately.
So there's quite a few things, Dr. Westlake, you were going to, I could see you wanted to say more. Go ahead.
It strikes me that these are things we're seeing really across a number of cities. So I was paying attention to the Vancouver municipal election a couple of years ago. It's a very similar story, where you've got concerns over taxes, concerns over, I mean, safety is an interesting way to put it, because it gets framed different ways by different kind of political sides, right? If we want to talk about safety from a more progressive standpoint, you'll see candidates talk about this as housing affordability, making sure people have access to homes. You see this from right-wing candidates, they frame it as policing and crime and punishment. But it's two ways of framing the same kind of issue. You've seen this in Vancouver, I imagine a lot of other major cities we've seen this, and now I kind of looked at the priorities that Cynthia Block and Gordon Wyatt, I think it's Gordon Wyatt, I'm getting his first name, what they talked about when they announced that they were running, it's the same kind of stuff. And so in some ways there's some interesting parallels between what we're seeing in Saskatoon and really the discourse in municipal politics that I've seen in a lot of other cities that have had recent municipal elections.
Yeah, and I mean, as somebody who kind of lives in the wheelhouse of this too, I mean, I think we've been noticing this across Canada. There's infrastructure issues and all this sort of stuff, taxation, as you said. But then there's these softer sides too that are coming in alongside the big projects. So here we've got the arena, the library, you know, we're talking about bus rapid transit, we've got the whole, you know, housing accelerator, you know, fund and all this sort of stuff. And it talks about the, you know, it comes to the relationships between the orders of government and that too that we want to explore with you as well. So it becomes really interesting. You dived right in here. I want to take us back a step though, if you don't mind. There might be some listeners here that are just trying to figure out what the heck is politics. Let's go back a little bit of a primer here. When we talk about right and left, and we talk about progressive. You want to explain a little bit about that, Professor Westlake? Because I think that's actually interesting for people to learn about, because we talk about that, but necessarily, especially when we start looking at the municipal context, what do we mean by that? What do you mean by that as somebody who studies this and teaches this stuff all the time?
Yeah, so this is kind of tricky because these aren't terms that academics invented.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of, there's an academic, Chris Cochran, who talks about these as discovered, in that people started talking about left and right, and then we as academics tried to figure out what they mean when they start talking about left and right. The left or the more progressive, you kind of got a mix mash of different things that fit into this. On the economic side, these are individuals that tend to want more larger government, which means more programs, but generally taxation that comes with it. And then on the social side, somewhat ironically, more socially liberal individuals, right? People who want government to stay out of people's ideas around morality, around how they should design their families and or form their families, and generally seek more inclusivity when it comes to these kinds of socio-cultural issues, be that women's rights, be that LGBTQ+ rights, and cultural diversity. Whereas on the right, you've got this kind of mix of kind of small government on the economic side. So these are individuals that want lower taxes, and with that comes lower spending on government services, but who might be more socially conservative, might be more comfortable with the government dictating morality a bit more, probably less friendly towards the feminist movement, probably less friendly towards LGBTQ+ rights. And then there's a host of other issues that get mixed in there. People talk about right and left-leaning foreign policy, but that becomes, that doesn't have necessarily a nice coherent fit. It's just people on the right tend to support these types of foreign policies. They get end up mixed in with the right. People on the left might support a different set of foreign policy, so they get mixed in with the left. So these are these more nebulous concepts that we probably use more than we've defined, which creates kind of some challenges for people just getting into politics for the first time around an election, or an election comes up and they said, okay, they want to start paying attention. There's this language that we kind of know it when we see it, but we don't have these nice, clear definitions that make it very easy or user-friendly when people try to get into this stuff.
I appreciate you saying that. Kind of following up on that. So if you're somebody that's just new to voting in Saskatoon, right? Let's think about it. Like, I mean, Anika, you're out there all the time on the streets meeting people that are just young and fired up and wanting to learn about Saskatoon. So how does somebody young start to figure out who to vote for and what these terms mean? And, you know, Dr. Westlake, feel free to jump in on this. But Keenan, like, what's your thoughts? You talked earlier about ideological, but I mean, whether it's at a provincial or federal level where there's partisan politics, and we'll add that layer in now, and in a municipal, as you said earlier, where there isn't, but then you're looking at the candidates. Share a little bit of your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's a million different ways that you could start to form a political consciousness.
That's a good way of putting it. Political consciousness. That's a really good way. Of putting it.
There's no wrong way necessarily. Well, I mean, there are ways that maybe I think are wrong, but yeah, it's a subjective thing. I suppose my advice for someone would be to identify the issues which matter to them most. You know, even if it's one, and there's a lot of single issue voters, I tend to think that it's better to think about a few different major issues. But if there's really one that stands out above everything else, then, you know, it's not wrong to vote based on that. It's just important to take into consideration that if your only concern is lower taxes, if you're choosing the candidate who wants the lowest taxes, you need to think about what else they want and whether those align with your other values. And conversely, if your main concern is that you want the city to spend more, consider if the candidate who wants that is generally supportive of your other beliefs. This is the issue. You know, sort of as Dr. Westlake pointed at, is that like these terms like left and right are reductive, and the issue is that people contain multitudes, and that there's not two coherent ideologies on this earth. There's infinitely many, and so it's a matter of trying to find the candidate who fits, who aligns with your beliefs the most, and what everyone will find is that there is no one who matches their politics precisely. And there's sort of two layers to that. There's one that just generally you're gonna, like I said, a person contains multitudes. There's 100 different, thousands of different specific issues that you have that you care about. So finding someone that aligns broadly with you, but not on those minor issues is one thing that's common. But then you will find is that only certain political ideas are viable. So if you are, on what people would call the fringe, like a fringe minority or a radical in either direction, you're going to find it very hard to find someone to support who has any chance of winning. So it's a compromise.
Dr. Wesley.
I think there are two very important things that Keenan highlighted there, and things that we don't talk about in politics enough. So the first is that most politics involves trade-offs. Most easy decisions where it's clear which side they've been taken, and those kinds of programs have been put in place. So you talk about taxes. You can support low taxes, no problem with that, but that comes at a cost. Part of that trade-off is you have less money to spend on social services. And the flip side of that is you can say we want more spending on healthcare and education, in the city context, put more into roads, put more into housing affordability, all that stuff. But that's going to have to be paid for, and so that has implications for taxes. The other idea is this idea of compromise, right? And we don't talk about that enough either, in that I think there is this tendency in a lot of the politics that gets a lot of oxygen in this current moment. Is this kind of hardcore, I'm defensive of my side, and this is morally right, and how could I ever change, right? Well, the problem, or maybe this is a good thing about democracies, is you've got a range of different people with different views. And as a collective, as whether we're talking about the city of Saskatoon or the province of Saskatchewan or the country as a whole, we've got to find compromises between large groups of people. And that's going to require some give and take. And so politics can't be just people entrenched in their side saying, if I don't get the candidate who's perfect for me, it's all rigged, or it's not worth my time. You need people who are willing to say, look, we need to form not necessarily a coalition that includes everybody, but a reasonable compromise that captures the views, or at least fits with or is acceptable to the views of a wide range of people in whatever government we're talking about, whether that be views of people in Saskatoon, or the people in Saskatchewan or Canada. And I worry in the political climate we're in now, we have a hard time talking about trade-offs, and we have a hard time talking about compromise.
Yeah, no, I agree to a lot of things you guys, well, everything, but a few things that really stood out to me was the compromise part, because I feel like a lot of times it's easy to keep saying, we want this, but then how are you going to get that? Something needs to take to give you something, right? So looking at the flip side, and not, because if we want to complain, we can complain about a lot of things, but the money needs to come from somewhere, right? So it's either you pay less tax or you get more social services. So, and one thing I liked what you said was, because again, as Lenore said, there's a lot of newcomers, and Saskatoon being a big city for a lot of new immigrants, a lot of times they don't know the context of the city, of the province, of the country. And I like when you said that pick things that is important to you and see which political parties align to few of them. And that cannot be all, but the closest, and kind of go to that route or through that route. So yeah, no, great answers. So yeah.
It's like, good points. I mean, it's on the newcomers, and then we also have our Indigenous peoples. And we have other orders of government. And I really appreciate what you're saying, because it's compromise and negotiation amongst orders of government. And so when you think of First Nations and Indigenous orders of government, Métis, Inuit, and otherwise, I mean, we have to really think here about how do we broker those relationships. So Keenan, in your studies, let's go here and see kind of your thoughts about that, because we talk about, setting the context here today on Voice of Saskatoon and Civically Speaking. Really want to set the context for getting the electorate excited. And this stuff, sometimes people are bawling, unless there's something like scandalous, why are we talking about it? But there's a crucial element here, and it's about our franchise, as you said, aligning with our own things of interest, our own values, and that. And then as to what you said in terms of compromise and looking at that kind of how do we navigate that. Let's go to these different orders of governments. Your thoughts there. How do governments need to talk to each other? Do they? Is it important for that to happen?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's important that that
was a little rhetorical there, but
I mean, the basis. Well, one of the many bases of government in Canada is a division of powers between like these different levels, right? I guess yes. If we're speaking to an audience who's new to politics, I'll say that the basic idea is that you've got the federal government, which is Canada-wide. Then you've got 10 provinces and 3 territories, which operate roughly the same. The difference being that the provinces are in the Constitution, the territories are not, which really ultimately just means that the provinces cannot have power taken away from them unless essentially you get a majority of the country to agree. There's an amending formula and all that. I don't think we need to get into, but whereas the territories exist at the whim of the federal government. The federal government is not going to just take away their powers randomly, but theoretically they could. But there's an analogy here that territories are to the federal government kind of what municipalities are to the provincial government, where the powers of municipalities, so municipalities just cities, towns, rural municipalities in Saskatchewan, have their power delegated from the province, and their power only exists because of the province. The province can take it away at any time. But much like the federal government isn't going to suddenly take control in the territories, the province isn't going to suddenly take control in the cities. Municipal governments are very valuable because the province does not want to be building traffic lights. That's much too small and local of an issue for the province to care about. So it's important that they work together, though, because there's everywhere there are intersections between their different realms. I mean, a hot button issue in Saskatoon right now is the Housing Accelerator Fund. Which I'm not read up on it a lot, but my understanding is essentially there is a funding source from the federal government which cities can access to help build housing, but there are strings attached. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So
and it's along zoning. Actually,
yes.
How you lay the land out. Yeah.
Yes. So you need to as a city, the federal government will give you this money if you change zoning laws so that you can build denser housing. So instead of like a single family house, a house that one family lives in, you can build like duplexes, fourplexes, that sort of thing. So that's a great example of intergovernmental collaboration, because the federal government has the money, essentially. Yes, the provinces collect their own taxes and cities collect their own taxes, but the federal government has a lot of money, and the federal government is also not responsible for most of the services that we care about sort of in our day-to-day life. So they transfer that money down, but it's also a way for them to exert their influence.
In about 30 seconds here for the first half here, because that was really good, in terms of because that is a hot button issue. 30 seconds, what else do we need to think about in terms of that? And we'll come back in part 2, but any initial thoughts just on that relationship between the orders of government?
Yeah, it's always been a challenge in Canada, and it is probably one of the toughest things for people who are getting into politics. You not only have in Canada the fact that you've got different responsibilities, governments get in each other's business. And so the federal government will use money to get involved in provincial jurisdiction, municipal jurisdiction. Sometimes that's cooperative, but sometimes the federal government's doing that in a way the province doesn't like, to advance goals the federal government has that the province or municipality doesn't have. And so they fight each other over this all the time. And that only makes this more challenging for people watching Canadian politics. If you like complicated things, Canadian politics is good. It's more challenging if you're looking for a more simplistic or a more straightforward understanding of some of the stuff. The reality of Canadian federalism is it's not straightforward, and it's not necessarily always easy to understand.
That's great. That's a great way of kind of taking us out on part 1 of The Voice of Saskatoon and Civically Speaking with our guest, Dr. Westlake and Keenan Ashton. So thanks for joining, and we'll be back right away to pick up on this conversation and get a little bit more into the minutiae of stuff. So thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you. I look forward to it.
Yeah.
You're watching Rogers TV.
Welcome back. So as we are talking about politics and information about politics, and it's very interesting conversation going on because it's very helpful for the newcomers and the people who will be voting for the first time. So I have a question starting from Daniel. Tell us a little bit about the role and authority of different level of the government, like federal, provincial, and civic. So because I think it will be very helpful for the people to understand different level of authorities.
Yeah, so for federal and provincial governments, you've got both of them as constitutionally protected. Federal government's doing things like foreign policy, banking regulation, and has a broad range of tax powers. They can levy kind of any tax they want, with the exception of anything kind of getting involved with natural resources. And then provinces have control over healthcare, education, a lot of the serious kind of welfare services, welfare state services that people are interacting with. And then on top of that, you've got these municipalities that are kind of creatures of the province. So what municipalities can do depends to an extent on what the province is willing to let them do. In most cases, we're talking about roads, we're talking about zoning. Property tax is usually the source of revenue that municipalities are going to draw on. So you've got that kind of structure. But then on top of that, you've got governments that get involved in each other's business. So the way that the federal government can raise taxes from wherever they like, that gives them more money than they generally have in terms of, then they have things to spend it on. So inevitably, the federal government will see this as an opportunity to take credit for doing some things in provincial jurisdictions. So you get a situation where, say, Canadians care about healthcare and education. The federal government goes, oh, well, we can get some credit for doing stuff in healthcare. And we're allowed to give our money to the provinces if we want to, and we're allowed to attach conditions to it. So the federal government will turn around and say, oh, we're going to spend a bunch on healthcare, but we want it spent in a particular way. And we're going to attach these conditions to spending on healthcare. Say in the situation right now, there's a housing crisis. People want governments to do stuff about the housing crisis, and they don't necessarily know that this is provincial and municipal responsibility. So the federal government turns, we can get some credit for doing some stuff on the housing crisis. Here's some money for doing stuff about the housing crisis. And we're going to attach things like zoning requirements to that kind of funding. That doesn't make it easy for voters, and the way we've set up our Constitution doesn't make it easy. When I teach this to my students, I say we're running an 1867 division of powers in 2024, in that we've given a bunch of things that used to cost a lot of money to the federal government, and a bunch of things that didn't used to cost a lot of money to the provincial government. But now those things we gave to the provincial government, healthcare and education, cost a lot of money, and we never adjusted the revenue to allow provinces to fund it. So that creates a lot of, not necessarily constitutional overlap, but in practice, overlap between what the three different levels of government are doing.
That's why you get all those ministers meeting all the time, eh?
Yeah.
People are going, what are they meeting about? Why are they doing that? But I mean, it's a really good thing. Now, explain a little bit more about that relationship between the province and the municipality. Because I know Anika's going to cue us up to what's coming up in fall. So explain that role a little bit more.
Well, unlike the federal government and the provinces, municipalities aren't constitutionally protected. So what they're allowed to do really depends on what the province allows them to. And the province has a lot of ability to tweak and adjust what municipalities are able to do based on its own whims. Now, there's a limit to how much you want to do that politically, because if you make a bunch of voters in your cities mad at you as a provincial government, you're going to get voted out of office. But everything from the way that council is set up to the election rules in a municipality, in a municipal election, they're set by the province and they're governed by provincial legislation. And I mean, even in like some cases such as Quebec, the province will dictate or set rules around what kinds of funds the municipality is allowed to accept from the federal government and what kind of conditions they're allowed to accept. So it's a tricky relationship between the municipalities and the provinces, and it's one in which, unlike with the province and the federal government, it's not an equal relationship. The municipalities don't really have a lot of power, at least legally, to push back against a province that wants to start dictating things to the city. They might have political power if they can mobilize voters to get mad at the provincial government. That's really all they can do.
Gotcha. Do you want to give an example? What would be an example of that? Or Keenan, does an example come to mind?
An example of the provincial government?
Yeah, provincial, municipal stressor.
So I can give one that's not a Saskatchewan example.
Yeah, and then Keenan will probably give one that's provincial.
Way back in the 1990s, the provincial government of Ontario decided they were going to amalgamate Toronto.
Yeah.
So they're going to take a lot of these things that used to be cities, North York, Scarborough, Etobicoke, and they're just going to jam them into Toronto. Well, there were, particularly in these smaller cities, North York, Scarborough, there's some opposition to that. Yeah. Didn't matter. Province passed the legislation through, and they said North York's part of Toronto now. They're in the same city council. Scarborough's part of Toronto now. Nothing that the municipalities of Toronto or North York or Scarborough could do about it. I have a smaller example from Saskatchewan. It would have been maybe 14, 15 years ago. The Sask Party said, if municipalities want to require candidates to have criminal records checks done, then they're allowed to do that. But that was written by the province into the legislation. And the province decided they didn't want to be heavy-handed, but they said, municipalities can choose to do that or not. But the actual amendment to the Elections Act that allowed municipalities to require candidates for municipal office to have criminal records checks submitted with their nominations, that was a decision made by the province in the provincial legislation.
Keenan?
Funny enough, my example also involved Toronto. It wasn't quite that one. It was a more recent one in which the provincial government of Ontario, I believe, dramatically shrunk the size of the Toronto City Council and then also centralized a lot of power in the mayor's office, something along those lines, which many people saw as political retribution from Rob Ford, because who was Premier of Ontario. He was formerly a politician in...
Well, it was Doug Ford, who was a Premier. His brother, Rob Ford, was the former mayor.
Yes, Doug Ford is the Premier.
Yeah.
But Doug Ford was also involved at the city level in some ways. Yes.
No, those are good examples. Anika, I know you want to jump into some local, but these are good context, right? Because it's about the roles of government. And as you said, it's somebody new coming in, into Canada. How do I involve whether they can even vote, because you have to be a citizen to be able to vote. So can't just be a landed immigrant. You've got to have that. So anybody that finally gets their citizen papers, congratulations. And this gives you the power to vote, right? It has your franchise. So, okay, take us into the local context, back to the local context.
Back to the local. So as we know, we have 2 elections coming up this fall, the provincial and the municipal. So what are some key issues you see that's concerning both of these elections? And what are your thoughts on the rollout of campaigns with the candidates for both of these elections? And either can start.
I mean, the provincial election, I think, is probably more straightforward. It's an election with political parties, which means you've got these groups of candidates that run under a particular platform, and you might not necessarily know what your local candidate stands for, but if the local candidate is a Sask Party candidate, you know what the Sask Party stands for. And most Sask Party candidates will fall in line with the same story on the other side of the kind of left-right spectrum with the NDP. And provincial elections, I mean, they tend to, healthcare, pretty much every province, every provincial election, healthcare matters. State of the economy matters. Often governments are punished more for the state of economy than they can actually do about it, but it tends to matter. Environmental politics and resource politics in Saskatchewan are always going to be important, given the importance of potash and other resources, natural gas, to the Saskatchewan economy. So in a lot of ways, the provincial election is fairly straightforward in that sense. Probably is also, from a results standpoint, the less interesting of the elections. I mean, the Sask Party is lower in the polls than they have been in recent elections, and that means they're at 50% instead of 60%. And so if you're a Sask Party supporter, maybe something you might be optimistic about. If you're an NDP supporter, not so much. And it's been like that for probably over a decade now. Municipal politics are tricky. The absence of political parties at the municipal level means it's a lot less clear where everybody stands. And it's not a lot less clear where everybody's coming from. And so there's a higher burden on voters in municipal elections to really research and to dig into each of these candidates, both for mayor and for council. Not necessarily, in a provincial election, somebody runs in the Sask Party, they're going to work with Scott Moe, and they're going to support Scott Moe. You don't have that municipal election. You have a council candidate. It's not necessarily clear whether they'll have a better relationship with, say, Cynthia Block, one of the candidates, or Gordon Wyatt, one of the other candidates.
Or Terry Tarasoff,
Yeah,
the
or-
third one.
yeah. It's not necessarily who's going to be able to
Yeah.
work together and what kind of legislation or what kinds of bylaws and rules they're going to be able to pass once they get elected to council, and how they're going to respond to different issues. So that's, municipal elections are always trickier.
Any thoughts on that, Kate?
Yeah, in terms of the rollout of the campaign, at the provincial level hasn't really got started going yet. And yeah, like Dr. Westlake said, it's a bit more cut and dry. I think one question will be whether voters are getting tired of the Sask Party government or not. They've been around for a long time. So far, the polls are indicating some of them are, but are enough of them to see a change in government? It's really up in the air. Obviously, the Sask Party's had a couple, I call them scandals lately, some various upsets, but they're also appealing strong to their supporters, thinking about standing up to the federal government on various things, that sort of thing. At the municipal level, obviously things are already going pretty strong. Obviously not a ton happening because we're still many months out, but the fact that we have a number, many wards have councillors declared, and we have 3 mayoral candidates running them, where there's already stuff floating around about these candidates because of, they're already getting involved. Of course, we had one candidate recently try to sue the city. Another candidate was just the provincial minister, so obviously he has a lot of very fresh, political. He has a political record that's very fresh, and people are scrutinizing it. And then the third candidate is a currently serving city councillor. So any gripes they might have with the direction of the city, they're taking up with her. So it's going to be a very spirited election season, I think, because there's all 3 candidates so far for mayor are coming from different directions, and people already have very strong opinions about them and their stances.
That's important conversation going on. So I have a question regarding, a lot of people are coming out for the municipal election, and there are many immigrants who are coming toward municipal election as well. How do you see immigrants can impact on civic election or provincial election? So I will start with Professor Daniel.
Yeah, this is increasingly a Canadian story. Canada is becoming a much more diverse place. That's true of now every province in Canada, and often this is certainly true in Ontario and British Columbia. I think it's becoming more and more true in Saskatchewan. You've got particular ridings, so electoral districts at the provincial level, wards at the municipal level, where you have large numbers of immigrants and people from racially diverse backgrounds that can really swing the results of elections. This means that if any candidate wants a serious chance of getting elected in Canada, it's hard. You can't come out as anti-immigrant. You have to listen very carefully to what immigrants and other ethno-racialized minorities want. It also means there are opportunities for people from immigrant backgrounds and ethno-racialized minority backgrounds to get elected. Like this story in Ontario is an old story, right? You look at places like Brampton, Mississauga, they're very, very diverse electorates, and you have diverse groups of candidates representing them. I think it's increasingly going to be at least an urban Saskatchewan story. I think as Saskatoon and Regina become more diverse, we're going to have more diverse ridings, and hopefully that means more diverse candidates at the provincial level and hopefully at the municipal level as well.
Yeah. Keenan, any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, first and foremost, in this front to the question of how can immigrants impact this, it's just like any other voter, right?
Yeah.
That, like Dr. Westlake said, Canada is experiencing higher levels of immigration. Of course, how many of those people become citizens and in what areas it impacts things, because like you said, they can't vote unless they're citizens. But it's a vital demographic to pay attention to. And when we talk about housing, it can become very polarizing. Obviously, immigrants benefit greatly from having increased housing supply, just like every other Canadian. But then you also have as has happened with more or less every issue in political history that people become polarized around it and will blame immigration for issues like the housing supply, or when there's no jobs, that's why, and so on and so forth. So it's important for immigrants to become politically active, not only because if they're a citizen, they have a right to vote, and it's important that they exercise that right. It's important to be aware that these are polarizing times, and you need to be politically aware and active in order to look out for your own interests.
Nika, question?
Well, you know what? I think I do agree with Canada, with so many diverse population. And again, only citizens can vote. So to get the right information and to even get in front of them, because a lot of times a lot of groups get missed out and they don't get the proper information to even go and vote for the candidates. But again, going back to what you said, is everyone should find what's their values and what they stand for, and then finding a party that do align with that. But yeah, I'll get Rashid to take the last question of the show, and yeah.
Not the last question. One of the last questions.
Well, I think I will prolong that conversation. So maybe if you can tell viewers, like, who can take part in the election, because that is the important piece. Like, many people don't know, like, who can take part in civic election, provincial elections. So if you can shed a light on that.
So taking part, I like the terminology taking part, because the answer is actually different depending on what you're doing in the election. For voting, you have to be a citizen. Here it is worth noting that Canada's very high citizenship uptake rates, so we shouldn't see that, I think, necessarily as a barrier to a lot of immigrants participating. But taking part can involve a much wider range of things. Most parties in Canada do not limit membership to citizenship. So even if you're not a citizen, you can still become a member. Most parties will still allow you to become a member to participate in nomination races. So if you're talking about the provincial election, who gets to run for each party in each kind of part of the province gets determined by members of the party that live in that area. And so you still have an opportunity, whether you're a citizen or not. I don't know if the Sask Party allows this. I suspect the NDP does. You can buy your NDP membership, vote in that nomination contest, and you get to have a say over who runs for the NDP. There's nothing saying if you're not a citizen that you can't go out and knock on doors and support candidates that you support, or go to protests or rallies, or show up at all candidates' meetings and ask questions that may sway the votes of other people. And so when we think about taking part in an election, we shouldn't just think about voting. Voting, yes, you have to be a citizen. But for all of these other things that are also important to election campaigns, you can still participate if you're not a citizen. Certainly you can do these things if you're a citizen as well. And they can be often as important as voting.
Yeah, those are really good points.
Yeah.
I want to kind of pivot here, but still keeping that in mind. Because in Saskatoon, we have an interesting thing that's happening in this upcoming election. We have a mayor who's an incumbent who's not running again. So the field is open. So for anyone who wants to, you can also still put your name in up until fall to actually run as a candidate for mayor. So fire it up, ready to go. Here's your chance. And anybody can do this. Who is a citizen, you could go ahead and do that. Okay? If you're not a citizen, you can volunteer in that person's gang, or you nudge them to vote or to run. Yet that's also the council races too. And we have a number of vacancies there. So Cynthia Block, because she's running as mayor, her ward will be open. We have David Curtin in Ward 3, which has been a ward that's had a lot of issues, particularly around homelessness and shelters. He's leaving. Ward 2, Hilary Goff is leaving. Marin Lowen is leaving. We've also got our other colleague, oh gosh, I'm forgetting her name, Serena Gersher, that's also leaving. And so there's a number of different folks that are stepping back. A lot of them are the women that were there, and so you kind of wonder what that's going to be. There's also been some people that stepped up without getting into the names, because I don't necessarily know every one of them, so I don't want to just narrow it to that. But we are already seeing people coming that are newer comers that are putting their name forward. That'll be interesting to see how much more we see of that. So again, a shout out to new Canadians, and also to anyone, young people as well, just encouraging the franchise to kind of exercise that. So whether you're thinking of running or wanting to volunteer on that, keep involved in it. So going to that, what else do we need for people to understand about kind of the modernization of elections? Like what are some things that we should be thinking about in terms of modernizing elections to get more people involved? What do we need to do? Because I mean, I'm just going to go there. We've got all this change on that, but in light of like, there's some hot topics with arenas and all this sort of stuff, and whether you're for it and taxes and that, okay, crime, the kind of the big ones that, you know, that have been mentioned. But how do you fire people up to actually get out there? So what does that modernization take in 3 minutes you've got? So, no pressure.
Yeah, so this is where, as a political scientist, I'm a little bit more of a downer than I think some people.
Okay.
I think when it comes to voting, we don't already know a lot about why people vote and don't vote, because unfortunately people who don't vote tend not to like to answer to election surveys either. But the best, I think, what our literature is able to say is that people tend to vote more when they care about politics and they're genuinely interested in politics, or when they feel they have a duty to vote. And there's been work by a couple of colleagues at other universities, Andre Blais and Jean-François Daou, that have written about Canada and other countries that suggest that this is the case. Those are really deep-seated things, right? These aren't the kinds of things where you make a change to the electoral system or a change to the way you advertise to people, and that solves the problem. You really need to make an effort, I think, to get people through the education system and through other kinds of outreach to really start to care about this stuff, which to me means having conversations about politics, getting people interested in politics, and talking about the importance of elections to being a citizen and being kind of part of a city or part of a province or whatever kind of unit we're talking about. Unfortunately, that doesn't give a lot of work to do in terms of modernization. We can do things around the edges that make things easier. Different places have talked about making Election Day a holiday. Make sure people have the time off. I don't know that it changes a lot for people that don't care about politics, but maybe it makes it a bit easier for people that do care and maybe see some barriers to voting and might not have otherwise voted. I'm skeptical of messing around too much of the impact that messing around too much of the electoral system might have on voter turnout. There might be other reasons to change the electoral system and to talk about that kind of stuff. I don't know that it does much for voter turnout. Similarly, I mean, we make voting very easy in Canada. I don't know there's a ton of gains to be made by making it easier in that respect.
No, that's interesting. Keenan, any thoughts for yourself coming as a student into this, you know, the next generations who, you never know, one day you might be prime minister or mayor somewhere.
I mean, yes, Dr. Westlake is right that there's lots of changes that could be made. There's even more changes that could be made but aren't likely to be made to how elections work that I would favor, but that...
Oh, share. You got to share one or two of
okay,
in 30 seconds or less.
Yeah, changing the voting system, for example. Right now we have something called first past the post. It has a lot of issues. There are some merits that could be discussed, but it's not very representative, right? If that was changed, it would likely mean that more political parties would be viable, and that could get more people interested. But that's an if on top of an if, and the powers that be have an interest in keeping that current system because it works for them. So it would only weaken them to change it, likely. So it's unlikely to get changed. One last thing I could think of is online voting. It's a thing in my home jurisdiction in the Northwest Territories. I've voted twice in territorial elections by email. I don't send an email. It's more complex than that. But they send me an email with a link and so on and so forth. It's secure. The only concern is that as soon as something comes online, you can question the integrity of it, and there's no way to convince regular people that it was secure. So it has downsides, but making voting a little bit more accessible, that's the one thing I can think of.
Yeah, well, that is a wrap. That was great information that you guys shared. So thank you so much for your time. We could go for another hour, but we just don't have the time. So thank you again for both of you for taking the time out of your day to come to our show, sharing your knowledge, and I'm sure we'll have you back at one point or the other.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming
you.
on.
Thank you
We'll
so
be
much.
back.
Thank you for
having us.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, take care, everyone. See us next month.